Thank you, and welcome to this Public Relations and Communications Association Charities and Not-for-Profit group event on misinformation and charities, which we're running in coordination with STEMPRA and with our speakers, who we're very grateful for attending and giving their time today. So if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat box, then feel free. Just a few bits of housekeeping. We are recording this session, and we'll make this available to kind of everyone who couldn't be here and join us for the information for the event. Yeah, just also there are members of the media who are joining us to listen in. So obviously, if you kind of put something in the chat box, it could be seen by members of the media. If you want to ask a question and you don't want it to be public and you want it to be anonymous, then please do message me privately and I can ask that question. So my name is Simon Francis, which I probably should have started with, and I'm chair of the PRCA's Charity and Not-for-Profit group, and I'm also founder member of Campaign Collective, which is a social enterprise that helps organisations with their campaigning. So delighted to welcome Rob, Grace and Ed to talk with us about misinformation and charities. I'll let them introduce themselves as they go, and what we thought would be great is just to hear a little bit from them about their perspectives on charities and misinformation, and what we can perhaps do to help stop the spread of misinformation. And then obviously we'll be opening it up for questions and for comments and discussions. So if you have a question, please put it into the chat box. If you want to speak, please ask for request to speak in the chat box, because Kyrie from the PRCA is host, not me, so he'll keep an eye on that to allow people to speak, and I'll call you in turn. So without further ado, I think best to hand over straight to Rob, who can introduce himself and say a few words.
Thank you very much. So I'm Rob Dawson. I'm Director of Communications at Meningitis Research Foundation, but I'm also Chair of the STEM PR Association. So one area I work on in my day job is improving access to and uptake of vaccines. We work with governments, public health experts and so on to try and ensure vaccines are available, and then with the public to make sure that we improve uptake. So you can probably guess, as a result, we face a lot of comments and questions from people that are either vaccine hesitant, so that means they have kind of genuine questions and concerns that they want to ask before they are vaccinated, or are anti-vaccine completely, where it's very hard to convince them to get vaccinated. So I first wanted to highlight that we mostly face, or in the past we've mostly faced misinformation, and misinformation is sort of sharing untruths accidentally, people inadvertently doing it, sharing and believing information that they think is true or that they have questions about. But more recently, we're starting to see an increase in disinformation, and disinformation is a sort of purposeful act of sharing information that isn't true. And we run a helpline. We get lots of questions from people, and we're seeing a real increase in those questions that are about information that has been, shared on purpose, that disinformation, particularly around things like conspiracy theories. You've probably heard of Pandemic and those sorts of films that have gone out that are very anti-vaccine. So we're having to answer a lot of those questions, particularly around COVID at the moment. Even though we're a meningitis charity, people are asking because we deal with vaccines. I kind of wanted to just quickly run through how we respond. So the first thing we do is we try to make sure there is a strong stream of verified and accurate information. So we work with coalitions and partners, including the NHS and so on, to try and make sure that there's accurate information around vaccines out there, which is important that information is being shared. But we also, I think at that point, I just wanted to add as well that it's really important that charities and other organisations are doing that, and that's why I think this call is really important, because while the government and even academics, share information that's accurate, they often get mistrusted and sort of brought into the conspiracy theories. They're seen as part of the conspiracy, if you like. So it's important that charities play a role in sharing that information. But information alone doesn't work on all audiences. We know that people that are really anti-vaccine don't respond to factual information. So it's important not to kind of group everyone in the same boat. Some people have genuine concerns and questions and will respond to information, but we often see that if they post something on social media, there might be misinformation and say, what can you say about this, or what do you think about this? They quite often get attacked, even if that person has genuine concerns and is genuinely asking a question. And evidence shows that it pushes those people to become more anti-vaccine and less likely to accept scientific information if they're faced with angry comments. So we really try to make sure that we're supportive to those people. We listen to their questions and listen to their concerns and find out what the root cause of their kind of questioning is, rather than just sort of throw facts at them and shout at them, which quite often happens on social media. So I think, we really try to segment audiences into those groups. When someone is really anti-vax or sharing misinformation, either purposefully or they might really believe it, but they're still kind of, unlikely to sway their opinion, then our way of responding is really not about trying to convince them, but trying to ensure that anyone reading the posts has access to accurate information. So we don't really address that anti-vaxxer directly. We talk to the people around the conversation and provide accurate information. And then the other thing we do is empower others to respond. So we work a lot with people and families who have lost someone to meningitis, so they know really, the vital role that vaccines play, and they want to tell their stories, but that can be challenging. So we give them platforms to do that, to tell their stories through our campaigns where we respond. So we'll share their story and respond on their behalf. Or we provide links to information. We provide toolkits of how to respond to misinformation, to try and get them to respond in a way that's going to be helpful. And we link out to lots of organisations. I'm going to hand over to a full fact in a second. We link to lots of other organisations where they can check information and use other tools. So that's kind of my 2 cents worth, if you like, for an introduction. I'll hand over to Grace, I think, next, to talk a bit more about full fact.
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Grace Rahman. I'm the online fact-checking lead at Full Fact. And this seems like the right place for me to be, as we are a charity that combats misinformation. And we have been doing that for quite a while, not to show off, but before it was cool, for 10 years or so. And we essentially were a group of fact checkers themselves, technologists, policy people who are all trying to work to improve information in the public sphere and stop bad information, whatever type of information that might be. So kind of more traditional stuff that you might think of. So politicians say things that aren't true, whether knowingly or unknowingly, or misinformation in the media, so traditionally newspapers, whether it's said on TV, and then more and more lately stuff that we're seeing on social media. And we also take a lot of questions now from our audience, our readers who already know us, and we have a kind of tip line on WhatsApp and all sorts of things like that. But yeah, our main thing is trying to make information better. So we don't just stop at writing the fact check. We also have people who are dedicated to, getting politicians to correct the record, getting corrections made in newspapers or whatever it may be. So we don't just stop at putting the right information out there. We try and fix the overall problem by making the information available to people better in general. And how do we do that ourselves? Well, all of our work is back-upable. So we would never ask our readers to just take our word for something. But we're journalists, we're not necessarily scientists or economists, although people have their specialisms. So everything that we write will be backed up with links to the original sources. And most of the work I do on the editorial team is trying to track down those original sources from whoever it might be. But my job as online fact-checking lead is that I look after our output when it comes to social media content, usually stemming from Facebook and Instagram and YouTube are probably the biggest ones. But we're also one of Facebook's fact-checking partners, which essentially means we check content on their platforms as, true or false, or a mixture of true and false, and whatever other ratings they have, and then Facebook uses that information from us to take action on that content. So they decide on those actions, but they can be all sorts of things, from reducing the spread of those posts to putting like an overlay on, so users can really easily tell that, you know, fact checkers have said this thing is wrong. And that has opened up a whole new avenue of work for us. We were doing some content on vaccines before the pandemic, certainly, kind of your classics about, say, you know, autism and some ingredients in vaccines, but it's safe to say that that has really ramped up in the last year. And we have a health fellow now that's kind of paid for by Facebook, which means we have a kind of specialist on the team now who is actually a doctor. So yeah, that just reflects on how much of our work now is so geared towards combating health misinformation. But yeah, we're also a charity, so we rely on individual donors and charitable trusts and all that kind of thing. Yeah, that's it from me.
Great, thanks. Ed, do you want to say a few introductory remarks?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, good afternoon, all. I'm Ed Proctor, CEO of press regulator Impress. We are the only officially approved regulator to emerge out of the 2012 Leveson inquiry into the culture, practices and ethics of the press. And we operate to protect the public and wider democracy by enabling publishers to build trust with their audiences, by raising standards, helping them to professionalize, reduce risks and increase skills. And we were created largely because trust in written press and news websites in the UK is worryingly low. In fact, the lowest in Europe. And in my view, that's largely down to patchy and inadequate regulation within the news sector. And Impress, over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, we've built up a membership of 100 independent news publishers who tend to be small to medium-sized businesses, cooperatives and charities. And some of the sort of publisher charities that we regulate include titles such as The Conversation, The Ecologist, and human rights publications like Each Other. So that's a little bit about Impress. And I just wanted to touch a little bit on misinformation and why it matters. I mean, certainly in my view and Impress's view, misinformation is one of the sort of greatest threats to sort of democracy in the 21st century. Contamination of the knowledge base that governs our world, that helps humans to understand and shape the world around us, is a huge, huge problem that infects on everything. And many of the things that you will be working on, science, health, politics, the economy, equality, family, the progression of individual freedoms, you know, everything that sort of defines us as an intelligent species. So we need trusted sources of news and information, like we need clean air, food, water, to kind of navigate our way around an increasingly complex world, to help inform who we vote for, what causes we support, what we eat, lifestyle choices we make, how we remain healthy, all these sorts of things. So you know, what we say is imagine a world, or imagine navigating around maybe an unfamiliar terrain with a fake map, or trying to build a piece of IKEA furniture with false instructions. You know, it's a hard task. So how does Impress support news publishers to combat misinformation? Well, Impress plays a unique role in the misinformation space because we don't just do one thing, we do several things as part of an integrated scheme of officially approved regulation. So we set and monitor governance and editorial standards, we investigate and adjudicate on complaints, we enforce breaches of those standards, and we settle libel and privacy disputes at low cost and low risk. And we also provide various forms of redress to readers and the wider public, including things like directed apologies, corrections, fines, and also a compensation scheme where serious harm or illegal activities have taken place on the part of a publisher. So what has sort of Impress learnt about the sort of misinformation space over the last 4 or 5 years? I think it's true to say that we've learnt that the internet has changed the face of news and journalism, because anyone with a smartphone and a broadband connection has now become a publisher. And organisations that might not have previously seen themselves as publishers of news and information have almost come so by default. So trade bodies, charities, education institutions, news websites, fact-checking organisations, online news groups, citizens journalists, bloggers, all in the publishing business. So the big challenge in the the online world is how we distinguish reliable sources of news and information from those that peddle misinformation, without losing the new freedoms of speech and plurality of voice that the internet has helped to create. So we need to recognise that accusations of fake news are increasingly being used as a political weapon to attack opponents and also to repress inconvenient truths. So I think we need to find better ways of protecting truth, regardless of how inconvenient those truths may be. So we need to support news publishers to act more ethically, to be more transparent, to be more accountable and accurate, so that they can distinguish themselves from unreliable sources and defend themselves against attacks of fake news. And I think we also need to recognise that misinformation is complex and it can be subjective. It's not a binary black or white judgment. Truth often is an evaluative process. Context is important, which is why at Impress we apply the ordinary reasonable reader test to evaluate the meaning of an article from an objective point of view. And we focus very much on the process that a publisher must have in place to avoid misinformation and to ensure accuracy. So we don't see ourselves to be an arbiter of truth. So the kind of measures that we take, we require publishers to take all reasonable steps to ensure accuracy. So checking sources, putting serious allegations to an affected party for response prior to publication, distinguishing fact from opinion through clear labeling, language and tone, correcting inaccuracies promptly and very prominently, and also attributing all third-party content and declaring conflicts of interest in a transparent way. So if I just sort of summarise just by saying that Impress, how do we support the charity sector in the misinformation space? Well, progressive journalism is under attack, and charities that run truth-telling and social justice campaigns are at risk from being undermined by misinformation campaigns against them. And it's really important, I believe, that charities recognise that they are increasingly becoming publishers of news and information, and that they must take action to manage misinformation better and to develop and protect their truth-telling functions. And what Impress offers is a voluntary scheme of self-regulation that's approved in law. And I think we can really help the charity sector, and we'd love to hear from more charities about how we may be able to help you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ed, and thank you all, Rob, Grace and Ed, for your sort of introductory remarks. As I mentioned before, we'll take questions and comments from the audience. If you have a question, if you want to put it into the chat box, just a reminder, there are 1 or 2 journalists here today, so if you want to have a question asked anonymously, then you can message me directly and I won't mention your organisation or your name, where it's come from. But I think I've got a couple of initial questions and observations, and then perhaps if Rob, Grace, said, if you've got questions to each other that kind of came up as a result of what people have said, I think it'd be useful to sort of do those first. I think probably the first question, just to sort of pick up on the point that you made at the end there, Ed, to sort of yourself and to Grace. And that's sort of how do charities get involved with your organisations, specifically, I suppose, from the point of view if they see misinformation about a cause that they are aligned to or about their own organisation. What's the process for kind of an Impress's point of view making a complaint? Or Grace, from your point of view, how do you pick the partners that you kind of work with in order to get information, and can charities submit information to Full Fact about the issues that they are experts on? So I don't know, Ed, if you want to take it first, and then Grace.
Okay, so Impress has two main schemes of, or three main schemes of redress. We have a complaint system where any member of the public, and that would include sort of charities and organisations, and they can submit a complaint to Impress if they're dissatisfied with the content of any of the publications that we regulate. And then Impress would assess that complaint against the editorial standards code and guidance that we publish on our website. We would then put that before an adjudication committee of expert lawyers, experienced journalists and civil society individuals who would actually make an adjudication that we would publish. And as a result of that adjudication, there are various systems of redress or powers that Impress has. So, I mean, we commonly require news publishers to post homepage corrections and apologies. We have powers to fine, and we also have powers to, in limited circumstances, to ask material to be taken down. We also have an arbitration scheme, which is really reserved for legal disputes to avoid issues actually going to court, which can be very expensive and unaffordable for most individuals. So we have a free arbitration scheme, which works for publishers because it's free for them to access, and it protects them against legal and cost risk. And it's also good for the public and for organizations because it's also free to access and you don't need to be legally represented. And we also have what we call an advisory notice scheme. So if, for example, you're an organization or an individual which is receiving unwanted press intrusion from any of the publishers that we regulate, if you can explain why that is and you have a good case, then we will issue a non-binding notice to all of the publishers that we regulate. And whilst they're not legally required to abide by the notice, if they don't, and then we find them to be in breach of the code, we will take strong action against them.
Thanks, Ed. Grace.
So with that question, there are kind of two main angles I can see the way we work with charities. First of all, it's kind of on the side of when we're writing a piece and we're looking for experts. So we talk a lot to the Science Media Centre and people at Cancer Research and people at the Vaccine Knowledge Project out of Oxford. So basically when we need a specialist, I'm so sorry, that's my doorbell, but it's a package they can leave outside, so it's fine. So yeah, it's the kind of people where that's really distracted me. It's when we need an expert to talk in that field because we have a specific query that we ourselves are not able to handle alone. And then the other side I can see it coming from is if a charity is concerned that there's misinformation about themselves. I mean, we always welcome any kind of tips or whatever if you see misinformation, whoever you are, but it's worth bearing in mind that the way we pick what to fact check depends on, you know, is it important, is it interesting, what's the potential for harm? That's something we're really thinking about at the moment when it comes to prioritization. And yeah, is it a prevalent issue? If it's on social media, for example, does it have a lot of shares? Was it said on primetime television? That kind of thing. So those are just things to keep in mind as to how we pick what we would actually check, although we always appreciate any kind of information if you do have it.
Great. And I mean, what we'll do is afterwards we'll send an email around to everyone who's taking part with kind of, you know, a link to the recording and also to kind of a follow-up blog that I know my colleague from the PRCA, Sam, is working on, and we'll be able to then kind of pick up and share any contact details that might be useful for charities to be able to get in touch and make use of those programs. I don't know, Rob, if you wanted to pick up on that point about how you've worked with sort of Full Fact and with other organisations in order to kind of push the truths and the evidence and ensure that the kind of misinformation is tackled anymore.
Yeah, I think one of the big things for us is forming those coalitions and making sure we're kind of sharing resources. I think charities do have a sort of duty to make sure a lot of health charities, for example, or people that are campaigning for social justice and so on. If you see that misinformation and you see organisations that are sharing the correct information, just make sure you're getting that out there, because if we can get as many people as possible sharing the steady stream of the truth out there. But we work a lot in coalitions with organisations, because we also find that if it's just us saying something and we don't have a group of people that are behind that comment, it's much more powerful with those coalitions. So yeah, again, if you're trying to share the truth or facts, make sure you've got partners on board that can kind of share that information as well.
And Rob, one of the points you brought up was the sort of the toolkit that you have to help people to kind of respond to misinformation online. What sort of things are in that, and how do you use that? How could charities how could they do something similar to encourage people to respond on this?
Absolutely. I mean, we're really fortunate in the vaccine space. I'm sure there is in other areas as well. And there's quite a lot of research done on combating misinformation and how to address vaccine hesitancy. So we make sure that our toolkit is evidence-based, so that we've got evidence behind what we're telling people to share. So the first thing I'd say is to go and have a look and see if there's research published in your area about tackling misinformation. You'll probably be surprised to find there's quite a lot of advice that's published in journals. And then we created a kind of list of responses that we'd used in the past, so that people could copy and paste responses that met those needs and that evidence, and so that people don't have to kind of think, how do I respond, what can I say, and then we just make sure there's lots of links to trusted sources and sources that people can share with their friends that they can link to, because that's one of the biggest things. They say, I believe this, but my friends don't. What can I send to them to show them? So we make sure there's a list of information that's accurate. And quite a lot. We provide quite a lot of links, so they can use different ones, and they can vary what they're saying. But it's mainly around that. We are moving on to training some of our ambassadors as well. So we have an ambassador network of around 100 people that have direct experience. And for them, we want to do similar to you do media training, say with the spokesperson, but having tackling misinformation training, getting them used to speaking, getting them used to potentially aggressive situations. Quite a lot of people face angry comments online and don't know how to deal with it. So just giving them some of those basic steps on how to present the information.
I think that's a really important point you brought up, is that sort of the link between the sort of the misinformation debate and another debate that I know we've talked about PRCA events in the past around hate speech online, and actually making kind of almost the risk of making supporters a target for hate speech if they go out and respond to some of the more vociferous misinformation spreaders online, and that's something then that I think charities obviously have to kind of think about when they're kind of deciding how best to respond to this, and sort of how best to support their staff and beneficiaries when responding to these issues. And I know that's something that the Charities Against Hate Coalition has published guidance on before. So if people aren't aware of that guidance, I would definitely sort of look out Charities Against Hate Coalition and check out some of the support suggestions they've made to charities dealing in this space. I mean, is that something that I think, Grace, you picked this up in your remarks as well, around sort of kind of misinformation as being used as an attack on people, and can be used to sort of spread kind of hate speech, and can be used to sort of kind of criticize people. How much of a problem do you feel that is online at the moment?
I mean, it's a bit of a difficult one. I mean, certainly we when we fact check people online who maybe aren't familiar with us or our work, and also that there can be a certain level of confusion when it comes to, and sometimes anger when it comes to particularly our Facebook work, where people, maybe if they don't fully understand the that their posts are completely public and therefore people can write about them or comment about them, and they might feel some kind of way about their post that's accidentally got 10,000 shares is now being written about. And I think an important thing there is our thing is really not to patronize. It sounds obvious, but sometimes the discussions about this can be kind of, how could anyone think this? It's ridiculous. But we always want to go about it with an air of trying to be really understanding and I guess kind, and also just, it can be easy to write about these things in a way that's also almost a bit kind of sarky, and like the research shows that is not very useful. So yeah, I'm not so sure about the kind of crossover with hate speech, although we do see kind of some patterns about communities that are targeted within misinformation. But yeah, I just think that's something to bear in mind when you are dealing with people who maybe start a little aggressive and then trying to de-escalate that.
I made the first mute mistake of the session. We were doing so well as well, 34 minutes. And just linked into that though, is a question that's come through on the chat, which is just about what typical charity behaviours would you most like to see change, and what are we getting wrong at the moment? I don't know who wants to take that one first. Rob, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because I think we assume that all charities are good at this, but they're not. Especially, I've worked in the health sector for quite a long time, and I worked in cancer for a while, and there were a surprising number of charities that are set up that were sharing information about sort of alternative treatments to cancer, and that people can go down whatever route they choose with treatments. But when there's things telling you to avoid proven treatments and so on, that was coming from certain charities. So I think I would encourage all charities to make sure that the standard of information that they have is really strong, that they have, and we have medical panels and scientific panels to check all of our information. And I would encourage everybody to do the same. Make sure that your information is robust, and that you have people that can check when you're responding to comments or just the information that's online. There are quite a lot of sort of kite marking as well, information standards and so on, that you can make use of. Again, it's quite a lot of time and effort, I know, for small charities, but anything you can do to just make sure that your information is robust, I think is really important. And the other thing is around, I kind of mentioned before, about how you tackle misinformation, in particular on social media. And the people that are sort of spreading misinformation, quite often charities might respond with the facts and assume the facts are good enough. But especially in the vaccine space, we have to do a lot of work around really listening to those people, and we use our support services to kind of encourage them to come onto the phone to talk, because actually, facts aren't always the answer, and sometimes they need to be listened to, and then they're more receptive to facts. And so if you have a way of spending time listening to people's concerns, make use of that and divert those people to those services, because actually some of the biggest breakthroughs we've had with people are when they just want to air a legitimate concern they've had in their life, somebody that they knew that was actually vaccine injured, or that something happened, and they had a bad effect, and then they don't feel that anyone listens to them. So yeah, so make sure your information is robust, and don't assume facts are the answer, I guess.
Would anybody else like to come on that?
Yeah. I think it was just to re-emphasize, I think, the point I made in my opening address, that I think in the digital age, that charities do need to see themselves as publishers. I think I read somewhere, and I'm sure Grace will fact check this, that there are as many journalists who are employed outside a journalism organisation as inside one, and I'm sure that many of the charities on the call today will employ journalists, and therefore I think it's really important that when charities look at their governance structures, that they just don't look at how they operate as a charity, but they see themselves as a publisher. They look at their editorial standards, they look at the governance arrangements around those editorial standards, and they also look at engaging with their audiences, because that's a really important part of publishing accurate information. that you don't have a sort of top-down approach to journalism and publication, but you have a very open, collaborative and transparent arrangement with your readers. And you know, you accept that you will make mistakes, you will make errors, but you need systems so that you can actually use your audience to help you be a better publisher that avoids misinformation and publishes more accurate information.
And I think, Ed, you mentioned about kind of, yeah, as you say, kind of, you know, some charities actually becoming kind of part of Impress and signing up to the code in order to sort of, you know, as Rob says, you know, kind of look at kite marks that are available to you, and Impress would probably be one of those that you could sign up to. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, certainly. I mean, I think it would tend to be charities that sort of publish a sort of magazine or a newspaper and employ perhaps journalists to actually sort of produce that sort of material. But I think most charities, you know, they are digital publishers through having a website, and I'm sure that most charities will publish communication specialists that work in that area. So I would say Impress is very much open to those sorts of charities, and we can really help you to improve your systems and to sort of combat the risks of misinformation, and also to build trust in your audience. And also the important thing, particularly if you're maybe a campaigning charity, because a lot of the publishers that Impress regulates may be sort of more climate change campaigning journalism, or you know, we have sort of political publishers on the right and the left, and they become very you know, a real risk of being subject to allegations of being promoters of fake news, not because they're publishing fake news, but because people don't like the opinions or the news that they publish. I think, as I said, they're publishing inconvenient truths. So I think being regulated by Impress provides a really good defense mechanism against unjustified attacks for fake news. And you know, and we have sort of left and right-leaning publishers, and we get many complaints, particularly about the more sort of partisan publishers. And obviously there are occasions where we have to take firm action and we require very prominent corrections, and we investigate. But a lot of the time the complaints we get are that people just don't agree or don't support the cause or agenda that the news publisher is following. And I think it will be the same with charities that are sort of agenda-driven charities. So I think that's really important as a system of being more transparent and being more accountable, and also defending yourself against those sorts of criticisms.
I think you bring up climate change, so let's get on to that, because obviously that's one of the bigger kind of another big area. We've talked about vaccines, and that is climate change is another massive area where sort of misinformation comes through. And I think worth mentioning that the PRCA has a survey out at the moment around kind of the experience of communicators and misinformation and the environment, and that will certainly be coming round in the email round that follows this for people to take part in. It's being conducted with opinion research to sort of understand the kind of the issue that's going on, and it will inform part of the work that the PRCA does around COP in Glasgow later this year. But I think that kind of links into another question we've had, which is around, which is a great question. I wish the person wasn't anonymous because I'd like to compliment them on the question, but how far is a mission a part of mis or disinformation? PR generally involves some bias towards your client. How far are we expected to disclose the opposing opinion, contradictory research in our communications? I think that's an absolutely fantastic question. And Rob, I think whilst I think about my comments on that, I'm going to go to you if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a brilliant question. I saw it come through as well, and I'm so glad somebody asked it. I mean, you know, with my STEMPRA hat on, the STEM PR Association hat on, we have guidance around this for press officers, especially if it's around research, about trying to make sure that the journalist you're talking to does understand the caveats and limitations of the research, and does, you know, treat that appropriately when you're telling a story. And, you know, I do understand that there's you know, you want to get headlines for clients, but you've also got to think about the potential, you know, reputation damage if it later, you know, people later find out that research wasn't quite as groundbreaking or so on as you're kind of making out. And really interestingly, Cardiff University did some studies with academic institutions. They asked them to put all of the caveats in the press release, and then they compared them to press releases that weren't caveated to see the types of coverage that people got. And there was, you know, it didn't impact on coverage. So it shows that you can include, you know, appropriate caveats around research and still get those headlines. And actually, you know, it saves the journalists a bit of a job of having to try and work out. They know if you're a PR or a charity that you're trying to promote something, and they're going to be asking for other opinions, hopefully, if they're a good journalist on the research anyway. So it saves them a bit of a job of knowing what they need to look out for and how they need to answer that. So I would say, you know, wholeheartedly try and put as many caveats in as you can. I know you've got to tell stories, but there's lots of guidance on it from us, but also from Science Media Centre as well, about what you should and shouldn't include in certain bits of coverage. And also the Royal Statistical Society has a lot of resources for people, because sometimes, you know, you might accidentally put something in there because you haven't understood the statistics, and that really helps you kind of figure out what you can and can't say about research.
Yeah, I think, you know, that it kind of goes back to the basic principles, isn't it, of making sure that where you're kind of commissioning data, you're working with organisations that are part of, you know, the Market Research Society or things like that, and that the tables are available to journalists. You know, kind of if you're afraid of making the tables available to journalists, you're probably trying to hide something, or your sample wasn't robust enough, and you probably shouldn't be sending the story out. So I think there's kind of some basic kind of principles that, you know, play here that people just need to remind themselves of. And I know it's difficult when you're, you know, kind of in the heat of trying to deliver for clients, but I think it's important to do that and maintain the standards that we expect to see from the media and from the kind of audiences that we're talking to, but also apply them to ourselves as well. Grace, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, chasing caveats is a big part of what I do, particularly when a charity, say, or any organisation has released some research, for example, like a survey or any research at all, really, where they usually haven't published the initial data or the survey data at the same time, which is just a basic part of, I mean, if you're working with a decent pollster, they should be doing that anyway, but a lot of the time it's just asking for the research that you're talking about in its purest form to get published at the same time. I think that it would probably make the initial coverage from media organizations probably better. I mean, the journalists are more likely to understand it. You're less likely to get us like knocking at your door asking about the caveats, and that's got to be better for everyone. And it just comes back to this thing of like backing, just being able to back up exactly what you're saying and being available for journalists to ask questions, just to make sure that the information they put out is not only what you want them to put out, but also correct.
Yeah, because there's sort of that kind of filter, isn't there, as well, of kind of then the media will then take your data and take your press release and then put their own spin on it. And certainly I remember one occasion where we'd said one thing in a press release, the journalist got the data from the research company, said something else, and you know, but you have to kind of, you know, that's part of what you think through as part of, you know, kind of your decision to go ahead with kind of activity. So moving on to the next question, just want to try and get through these in the time we've got. How much, from Rebecca, so how much does trust play a role? Who the information is presented by and how they present it, not just what that information is. So Ed, do you want to, so obviously, you know, trust is a big part of what you're trying to achieve through the work of Impress. How much does trust play a role?
No, I think it plays a huge role, and I think behind trust is what I would say transparency, and transparency, and this kind of links in to the last question. You know, we have a rich tradition of partisan journalism in the UK, unlike broadcast media, where there is a sort of due impartiality rule. Within the Impress rules, publishers are allowed to be partisan, so they can pursue an agenda, but you know, you have to be really transparent about that. So you have to be transparent about your agenda. You have to be transparent about your sources, and you have to be really clear about what's fact, what's opinion, and if you're going to give an opinion, you can't base it on false facts. So I think it's about a sort of process of curation, which is really, really transparent. And that's really what Impress is trying to achieve, a much more transparent, open culture of news media, which you know, I don't think has always existed. And I think is probably the reason why the British written press in particular is the least trusted in Europe.
Great. So Rob, do you want to add anything to that?
I'll just add, we've found it can be tricky to figure out who people trust, and it can be different for different audiences. So it's worth kind of thinking about that when you're thinking about trust. So in a different life, I was working on HIV testing, and actually we used religious leaders a lot as the people to bring trust into that conversation. So just worth thinking about who provides the information. With the vaccine work we do, there's a lot going out from government at the moment on COVID, but we know that people aren't listening to that because they don't necessarily want to trust the government. So we're working with other organisations to try and make sure that messages get out from organisations that people are more likely to trust. So it's about for me it's about trying to work out who's trusted, as well as giving messages out there.
Great. So another question from Sam. Grace talked about how full fact about how harmful it is question. Can the panelists talk a bit more about how we would triage when something is harmful and dangerous and needs to be tackled and analysed, and when it's false but innocuous or lower risk? So there's so much out there, you can never tackle everything. So how do you prioritise? Grace, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, this is my whole life. Yeah, I mean, usually for us, it's what can cause, I suppose, the most immediate harm, and that would mean physical harm initially, but then any kind of harm to well-being, and then after that we have kind of the harm that comes from, total distrust in democracy or the government and the decisions that would lead someone to take that could potentially harm them in general. So yeah, it's certainly a difficult thing to do. I mean, for example, when we have kind of big news events, so for example, kind of terrorist attacks, and we are fact checking those kind of things, and we're seeing maybe photos that make some claim about an individual or a demographic, so we would see those as kind of, really potentially harmful immediately. So it doesn't have to be, necessarily like all content that tells people not to get vaccinated is the only bad kind of, the worst kind of content. I mean, there are other ways where this stuff can be, can certainly be harmful. And we do see that in relation to kind of charitable, a lot. So some of the things that we fact check about charities or things that are related to charities, there's the obvious stuff about kind of where does the money go and who's on the board, that kind of thing. But then also we get things like the actions that charities do. So we did something a few months ago about, I think it was women could claim free train tickets to travel to domestic violence shelters. And there was some kind of misinformation going around about that. It wasn't totally wrong, but it was, I mean, you can see the harm in someone turning up to a train station expecting one thing and not getting that when it came to securing place at a shelter. So stuff like that, where it doesn't seem like super obvious. I mean, the potential for harm there is huge. So it can come in different forms that might not seem like, oh my God, if you don't get the vaccine, you're going to die immediately. And the doorbell again in my house, my God.
Thanks, Grace. Does anybody else want to pick up whilst Grace gets the door?
No, well, I'll just say, I suppose from Impress's point of view, people tend to come to us to complain when something is more serious. I mean, it's unusual that someone's going to make, is going to, waste time making a sort of trivial complaint. So you tend to find that people come to us when something is more serious. So in a sense, that acts as a kind of bit of a filter. And I think the other thing is we do have a significant inaccuracy test, which means that if someone complains to us, we'll We will assess whether or not the inaccuracy was significant, and whether it actually affected the overall meaning or message in the story. So if something was a sort of trivial, insignificant fact, then it's probably something that wouldn't worry us too much. And also, we're particularly concerned, and I suppose the most common sort of problem we have is where news articles are published about individuals, and then they become the sort of target of online harassment or pile-on harassment. So if people complain to us, then we will ask them for evidence. So for example, we had a recent complaint by one of our right-leaning publications who published some misinformation about the sort of Brexit campaign of Gina Miller. And as a consequence of that, she received a whole barrage of hate. And as part of that, that her team that were complaining on her behalf were able to provide that evidence to us. And we worked really, really quickly and really hard within hours to ensure that that issue was dressed as a remedial issue before we then went on to adjudicate on the issue. And as a consequence of that, there was a sort of published apology, correction, and there was a YouTube video that was taken down. So really important.
The challenge, I think, with some of those situations, though, is that the damage is done by the thing appearing in the first place, isn't it? And it's much harder, much harder to then sort of go back and sort of, you can't reach everyone who saw the original piece with a correction or a clarification. And that kind of, how do you get that back into kind of people's minds? You almost need to then have a campaign to then get the truth into people's lives.
That's really, and this is really important, because this is, I think, what distinguishes Impress as a sort of public interest rather than a sort of private interest, commercially driven regulator. Is it's the prominence of the correction that's absolutely crucial. So we have a policy of equal prominence, which means that it's not a sort of correction in small print on page 6. So if it's a front page story, then it has to be a front page correction that we will normally require them to pin for 48 hours as their main front page story. We will also require them to distribute the correction through all social media channels that they originally communicated the story. So the idea is that the correction should be equivalent to the original story. And that acts as a huge deterrent to publishers against making those sorts of mistakes, because they are kind of named and shamed in a very open way. And that's something that traditionally the sort of written press in the UK has been really bad at, really, really poor. It hasn't wanted to own up to its mistakes. It's wanted to bury corrections in back pages. And I think that's a real area where, if we're going to build trust in news and journalism, you need sort of corrections to be much more prominent and distributed through the same channels as the original news story was.
Rob, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just sort of thinking back to what organisations can do to sort of, when they're thinking about which kind of misinformation they need to tackle. So if you're trying to do it yourself from a charity and you're trying to prioritise, and it was a really interesting piece in the BMJ where they had a head-to-head on whether misinformation should be criminalised. It was in February, and looking at the kind of how it could work. And I think it's really tricky to try and measure the potential harm that something can do if you're trying to decide how to respond. And I know there's quite a lot of research going on at the moment to try and kind of quantify how much harm misinformation does. But for us, we have to just try and use our judgment and think which pieces of information could potentially have the most harm. But we also look at things, we have social listening tools, so it's worth kind of thinking about that and looking at the kind of volume and velocity of different messages that are going out, and to see if things are catching on, to see if things are taking off, and then those become our kind of priorities to address. So that's something that organisations can think about too.
I think that's really helpful, actually, that kind of, the sort of almost the test then for kind of organisations looking to respond is there's the sort of the significant inaccuracy test that, kind of Ed talked about, and then there's the sort of the volume test that you talked about. And I think, keeping those two kind of thoughts when you're triaging what you should and shouldn't invest time in is something that perhaps we could, as a sector, kind of think about going forward. I suppose we've got a couple of minutes left, so I wonder if, yes, there's just sort of perhaps just pick up the last question from chat, and then I think that might be us, I'm afraid, but is there something to be learned from the way academic journals handle corrections and retractions? Not that they've always had a great record, and some estimates suggest at least half of all papers' conclusions turn out to be wrong. I think we might need to fact check that fact, but yeah, is there anything that we can learn from kind of the academic journals? Rob, I mean, you spend your life, I think, reading academic journals.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's, I think charities are doing more of that in terms of getting more information. And again, it's about the kind of, you know, with journals, we get peer review and we get other people to check and make sure that things are accurate. And I think that's what charities should do as well, you know, making sure we mention sort of kite marking and so on for our own information. You know, it's good to get other people to check your work. And I would say that's probably the biggest thing we can learn from them. You know, in terms of kind of retractions, again, you know, I think it's the same with the press, just they make sure that things are prominent and they try and communicate genuinely about the mistake and make sure that people are as aware as they were about the original paper. And so I think, again, you know, that's what we should be doing. That's what all organisations should be doing. If they've sent something out that they know is incorrect, they should genuinely try their best to rectify that.
Great, and thank you, Patrick, for offering to provide the references. That would be genuinely useful if you want to send them to Kyrie at the PRCA, who I think everyone has emailed with links to today, so we can include that in the roundup that we do. Conscious of time, and unfortunately it's 1 o'clock, and I've got a dog that will need walking very shortly. Is there any, from the panelists' point of view, is there anything that you'd like to pick up on that perhaps we didn't cover in as much depth as you would have liked, or any final remarks that you want to make based on what we've talked about today? No?
For me?
Great. Well, thank you so much to the panelists for giving up their time. Thank you, everyone, for attending and for asking the questions.